major news today, the biggest piece of news is basically Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq, has given 3 days to the Mahdi army to, as far as I can tell, in essence, surrender, to turn over their weapons and tell Maliki's government how very sorry they are. I don't see that as altogether that likely. And on a day where there is such large Iraq news, and in a week where there's been a lot of news coming out of Iraq, we start with our first guest, who couldn't be a better guest given the topic matter. Juan, a preeminent expert on Iraq in America, if you ask me. Professor from the University of Michigan, writes the blog Informed Comment, which you can find on juancole.com, and he joins us now. Professor Cole, how are you?
Just fine, thank you.
All right, let me start in with the news from today. So 72 hours and the Mahdi army has to peaceably turn over their weapons. That's not going to happen. On the other hand, you have Muqtada al-Sadr's folks telling the Iraqi government, hey, here's our list of demands, including releasing all of our prisoners. That, it appears to me, is also not going to happen. So, does that mean that we are definitely going to have an enormous clash here, or can something else happen in between?
Well, maximal demands are being made, which is not promising. It just depends on how serious the parties are about these demands and what kind of compromises might be possible.
And what's your sense of it? Do you think that they're going to come to some sort of solution before there's far more bloodshed, or do we need to do some bloodletting before we sit down at the table?
Well, the parties involved are the Iraqi government on the one hand, which is actually controlled by the Dawa Party and the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. And on the other hand, they are now taking on the Mahdi army militiamen who dominate these very slummy parts of Basra, like Hayaniya. The big struggle really is over petroleum and security. The Mahdi army has been stealing gasoline and kerosene, essentially, from the Iraqi government. Mm-hmm. It's estimated anywhere between $2 and $5 billion a year is being siphoned off by the militias through petroleum smuggling. And the Mahdi army fights turf wars with other party militias and with tribal mafias for control of those areas from which the gasoline and kerosene can be stolen.
I'm sorry, Professor Cole, did you say $2 to $5 million worth?
Billion.
Okay, that's what I thought. I was like, $2 to $5 million. Is this what this whole thing is about?
$2 to $5 billion, which would buy a lot of machine guns.
Yeah, I suppose it would. And it would buy a lot of power within Iraq. So before we go any further, I think it's important to clarify who the parties at hand are. So the governing party is, I see two names being thrown around, the Dawa Party and the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. Are they two separate entities? Are they related? What's the story behind that?
So the Dawa Party, which means the Islamic Call Party, was founded in the late 50s, and it was kind of the original Shiite fundamentalist party of Iraq. And it was founded to combat the influence of secular parties like the Ba'ath, Arab Nationalist Party, and the Communist Party. So it's been, it's the mother lode, the old vehicle for Shiite religious activism of a political sort in Iraq. And then it was cracked down on hard by Saddam in the 80s and 90s and is a shadow of its former self. And a lot of Iraqi Shiites were forced out of Iraq under Saddam and fled to Iran. And there the expatriates formed something called the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. That's headed by Abdulaziz al-Hakim and is very close to Iran. And so it's now changed its name. I think it figures the revolution has occurred. So it's now the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. The Dawa and the Islamic Supreme Council have an alliance. They are both pro-American and pro-Iranian, but they face resistance to U.S. troops remaining in Iraq from the Sadr movement of Muqtada al-Sadr, and they face resistance to Iranian influence from the Muqtada al-Sadr movement.
So which of the two parties between Dawa and the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq is larger?
Oh, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq is much larger than Dawa now. And it won the 2005 provincial elections. So the Islamic Supreme Council controls the provincial administrations of many of the Shiite provinces of the south, as well as of Baghdad and Diyala.
So the fact that the Dawa party has some degree of power here is mostly because the Prime Minister, Maliki, is from the Dawa party, and he was chosen as kind of a compromise. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, the problem for the Bush administration and the Iraqi government was that the Islamic Supreme Council is dominated by clerics who are close to the Ayatollahs in Tehran, and they won the 2005 elections both times. Remember how excited the American public was about the purple thumbs and the turnout and so forth. Mm-hmm. But they didn't seem to understand what was going on, which was that the Shiite clerics won. So, but you know, it makes for a bad image to have someone from the Islamic Supreme Council come out in a turban as the prime minister. And so the Dawa party, the Islamic Call party, had tended to be more lay, you know, as physicians, attorneys, people like that. So they basically turned to that partner to provide the prime minister because he puts more of a secular lay face on the thing.
I got you. And the Badr Brigade, this is very important to me because they seem, you know, it's the militias that seem to have the power on the ground. Which party is the Badr Brigade associated with, and is it a definitive link, or is it a more of a loose kind of link?
Oh, no. The Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq runs a paramilitary, the Badr Corps, which is both a political and a paramilitary organization. It was trained by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. It probably still gets a lot of money from Iran. And since the Islamic Supreme Council won the federal and the provincial elections, it has managed to infiltrate the Badr Corps into the government security forces.
Aha.
So when you say that al-Maliki sent security forces into Basra, you're really probably saying that he sent the Badr Corps into Basra.
Now we're getting to the core of the issue. I suppose the Badr Corps. Okay, all right, sorry. So the Iraqi army is fighting with the Mahdi army, right? And this is shown in two lights in the American media. One is the Mahdi army is trained by Iran, and anything that they do or any attacks on the U.S. or Iraqi army is actually funded by Iran. But it seemed to me, and that's part of the reason we have you on to clarify these matters, that the Badr Corps is actually more connected, or was historically, and perhaps today is still a lot more connected to Iran than the Mahdi army is. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is, who the hell is the Iraqi army? But we'll get to that next. So first on the question of Iran. Is it the Badr Corps, the Mahdi army, that is connected or more connected to Iran?
Oh, the Islamic Supreme Council of Abdulaziz al-Hakim and his Badr Corps paramilitary are very close to Iran. They were funded and trained by Iran. And the dirty little secret that the Bush administration wouldn't want widely recognized is that the United States and Iran are de facto allies in Iraq, and they have the same friends in Iraq. So this stuff that they're bringing out, that Iran is behind the Mahdi army and that's causing all the trouble and so forth, simply not true. And it is propaganda.
The Mahdi army, what kind of links do they have with Iran? Now, I understand the Badr Corps is far more connected to Iran, but what about the Mahdi army? Is there any truth behind that, or are they a lot more nationalist, as I've read it in the past, and more connected to Shiites in Iraq rather than in Iran?
Yeah, the Center movement and the Mahdi army, their center of gravity is a kind of Iraqi nativist politics. They complain bitterly about Persian or Iranian influence on Iraqi Shiism. They don't have good relations with the Ayatollahs in Tehran for the most part. Now, it is alleged by the U.S. that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards has trained and funded a few kind of rogue units of the Mahdi army called special groups. That's possible. That is to say that there are some elements in the Mahdi army that have established some links to Iran, but those are probably the ones least under the control of the leader of the movement, Muqtada Sadr, who, as I said, is much more independent of Iran.
Okay, so then let us get to one of the principal questions, which is the Iraqi army. People talk about, oh, we got to stand up to the Iraqi army, and the Iraqi army is going to is part of the central government of Iraq and represents all of Iraq. This too seems to be a myth to me, because every story I've read about Iraq and the Iraqi army seems to indicate that there are some folks who really believe in a unified Iraq, but they've nearly been run out of the army and the security forces, and they are a significant minority. Do I have that right? And if I do have it right, then who, in fact, is the Iraqi army?
Well, initially, the Iraqi army was recruited from non-sectarian or non-militia sources. And I think at first it tended to be a little bit less politicized in that way, certainly than the Special Police Commandos of the Ministry of Interior, which is another national kind of police force. But over time, it's my firm impression that the army was sectarianized. First of all, there are apparently few mixed units. There are a lot of units that are Shiite or Sunni, with the Shiites predominating. There are Peshmerga Kurdish units. So it is a very divided army internally. And then I believe in the last 2 years, as far as I can tell from open source reporting, the recruitment drives, the desperation just to get men in, have resulted in large numbers of Shiite militiamen from the Mahdi army and the Badr Corps getting into the army. So I think that the Badr Corps is an important element of the Iraqi military now. That might not have been true 2 years ago. I think it's true now.
We're talking to Juan, professor from Michigan, who I really believe, and I think most people believe, is the preeminent expert on Iraq in America. His website's juancole.com. It's also called Informed Comment. Professor Cole, that brings us to the battles on the ground that's happening today in Basra, Sadr City, etc. So when they say the Iraqi army is fighting the Mahdi army, there wouldn't be Kurdish or Sunni troops down there, would there? Wouldn't that cause more of a problem? But maybe there are, I don't know. And there's certainly, if it has been infiltrated by the Mahdi army, how does that affect when the Iraqi army begins to fight the Mahdi army?
Right. Well, my guess is that they sent in, I haven't seen anything on the exact composition of the Iraqi military forces sent into Basra, but my guess is that they mainly sent in the Badr Corps of the Islamic Supreme Council. And the Islamic Supreme Council has been very unhappy with the situation in Basra. They had a fairly powerful position there, but they're in severe competition with other Shiite groups. And they had a big demonstration in Basra about 2 weeks ago, Islamic Supreme Council, against the way the government down there is being run and against militia violence, which is kind of ironic. So my guess is that this is Badr on Mahdi fighting mainly.
So basically, the U.S. forces have, in essence, here picked sides, and they've decided to go with the Badr Corps militia as opposed to the Mahdi army militia. And not only have they picked sides in this inter-Shiite militia warfare, but curiously, we've picked a side far more associated with Iran.
That's correct, because behind the scenes, the Bush administration is far less worried about Iran than it pretends to be. And so that our major allies in Iraq are pro-Iranian doesn't actually bother anybody in the U.S. government. But they put on this facade of concern. And what they're mainly interested in is finding Iraqi allies who will say that they want U.S. troops to stay in Iraq, which the Islamic Supreme Council does say, and which is interested in developing Iraqi petroleum in such a way that U.S. majors can get in there and get the contracts, which the Islamic Supreme Council is also happy about. Whereas the Mahdi army, the Sadr movement, are Iraqi nativists. They want the U.S. out on a timetable. They're not so gentle towards international capital. So obviously, the Bush administration's interests lie in crushing the Mahdi army on behalf of the pro-Iranian Islamic Supreme Council.
That isn't ironic. All right, I'm not quite sure what is. So the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq is the largest party in Iraq, thereby leading me to believe that they have more voters and more Iraqis behind them. But at the same time, whenever I read stories, the Mahdi army seems to be so much more firmly in control on the street, if you will. So that leads me to the question of who's bigger, the Mahdi army or the Badr Corps?
Well, I think there's a shift going on. In 2005, when they last had provincial elections, the Islamic Supreme Council was very well organized, had a lot of canvassers, and won the elections, so they were probably bigger. And the Badr Corps is trained cadres. They're not just street kids the way the Mahdi army is. A lot of the Mahdi army is just my slum gangs. But the Badr Corps is, trained military guys or paramilitary guys. So, but now over time, I mean, what I hear from on the ground in Iraq is that there's a shift in people's political consciousness towards the Sadr movement and the Mahdi army and away from the Islamic Supreme Council.
So they're at least gaining power, and this is partly a political battle as well, because the Mahdi army thought that what the Supreme Council was doing was trying to take away their ability to win the provincial elections that are coming up in October, I believe, and so that leads me to believe that that they had not only gained power on the streets, but also gained political power so much that the Supreme Council was afraid of that political power.
Yes, I mean, if there were free and fair elections, a lot of my contacts in Iraq or people who have been there believe that the Sadr movement would sweep to power in all of the Shiite provinces. And of course, that's where the petroleum is. And this would be a disadvantage both for the Islamic Supreme Council that would lose all that power and potential future income. It's also a problem for the United States insofar as the Sadr movement is demanding that the U.S. leave. So all of this maneuvering may ultimately and distantly be about the October provincial elections, although I think with regard to Basra, it's probably a little bit more complicated because the Sadr movement is not a majority in Basra. It's not as powerful there as it is in a lot of other places. And I think it's mainly seen there as a security problem.
And a quick aside here, the Interior Ministry and the Iraqi police that we often hear about, how about who controls them?
Well, the Interior Ministry and the Iraqi police are largely under the control of the Islamic Supreme Council and of the Badr Corps.
Okay. And finally, you brought up the issue of Iran and the fact that, of course, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq is more closely aligned with Iran and that Iran is actually, in essence, our ally in Iraq there. So we get to the million-dollar question that everybody seems to ask about Iran, which is, what's our real purpose there? If we're basically putting on a dog and pony show about how angry we are about Iranian interference, when in fact we are happy with Iranian interference almost, is it to stoke up a war, and what would the purpose of that war be?
Well, the Washington doesn't like the government in Tehran and would like to see it fall or be changed, and so they're constantly putting various forms of pressure on Iran. Iran is just seen as a bad character in the region. It won't recognize Israel. It won't acquiesce in U.S. hegemony in the Middle East. It interferes with U.S. investment. It promotes militias like that of Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, which has an impact on U.S. investments in the Levant and U.S. security concerns in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's just behaving badly from Washington's point of view. It's an obstacle of various sorts. And so the U.S. Wants to contain it, wants to roll it back, wants to overthrow and do regime change. in whatever way it can, and by constantly doing propaganda against Iran, that it's destabilizing Iraq or that it's trying to get a nuclear weapon or all of these things, which were probably mostly not true. It's just a kind of global hegemonic politics of the U.S.
But if we do, in fact, bomb Iran, isn't that going to cause us a tremendous problem with their ally, Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, who now rules Iraq?
Well, I think it will cause trouble among the Shiites in Iraq if we bomb Iran. There will be a certain number of Shiites in Iraq who will be sympathetic to Iran and who will further turn away from the United States, because initially the Iraqi Shiites were allies of the United States. They were very happy about the overthrow of Saddam. But gradually a significant proportion of Shiites has developed severe doubts about the U.S., and I think that bombing Iran would push more of them in the direction of those doubts. The Islamic Supreme Council might not say much because it knows which side of the bread its butter is on, and it's got a very strong American alliance. And if the attack were on putative nuclear facilities, then I don't think most of Iran's neighbors, are very happy about the idea that it might get a bomb. There's not good evidence that it's trying to do that, but they're all a little afraid of Iran. So I think there'd be a lot of crocodile tears in the region, but secretly people would be pretty happy about it.
That's interesting. Final question for you. When generals on the ground, in the field, as it were, like General Petraeus, come out right after the mortar attacks against the Green Zone, and without really apparently having much time to study the issue, say, oh, it was Iran who did it. Are they being political creatures there and just putting out the propaganda that the government wants and the Bush administration wants without really looking into the evidence?
Well, I think it's a complex issue because what they would say is that they've got good evidence that the weaponry being used, the mortars and rockets and so forth, Katyushas, is coming in from Iran. And they did get commitments from President Ahmadinejad that he'd stop that weaponry coming in. So Petraeus says he feels betrayed that Ahmadinejad broke his promise and so forth. But I don't know. I think that the statements that came out did make it sort of look as though Iran were directly hitting the U.S. in the Green Zone, and that's surely not true. It's very obvious that this was the Mahdi army and that it was angry about its commanders being arrested during the truce. They felt like the Americans and the al-Maliki government are unfairly taking advantage of the truce to detain their commanders, and that if there's a truce, then there should be a truce.
Right. Juan Cole from juancole.com, informed comment. I can't begin to tell you how educational this interview was, and of course if you want to read more about Iraq and understand it better, you can go to juancole.com. Thank you so much for joining us on the Young Turks. Really appreciate it, Professor Cole.
It's my great pleasure, and just to remind your readers, my new book, Napoleon's Egypt, is in bookstores.